There is a version of history that most people have accepted without examining it too closely. It goes something like this. Two superpowers spent roughly 4 decades glaring at each other across ideological and geographic lines, building weapons they never used, issuing threats they never carried out. And eventually, one side simply collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The Cold War in this version was tense but ultimately manageable. A controlled competition, a long standoff with a clean ending. That version is wrong. Not in the sense that the facts are fabricated, but in the sense that the facts that have been quietly set aside, classified, buried in archives, retracted from public testimony, or simply never reported, constitute an entirely different story. A story in which the world as it currently exists, with its cities intact and its populations breathing, is not the product of wise statesmanship or careful deterrence theory. It is the product of coincidence, of malfunction, of one man on a submarine deciding, against protocol, against the logic of his situation, against every pressure being applied to him in that moment, not to turn a key. What follows is that other story. The one governments on both sides spent decades constructing bureaucratic architecture to contain, minimize, deny, or simply never acknowledge. It is not a dramatic story in the conventional sense. There are no speeches at its center, no heroic confrontations. Most of its critical moments happened in silence, in the dark, in rooms where the people present were not permitted to speak about what they had witnessed, sometimes for the rest of their lives. The danger was procedural. The systems were designed to function without the friction of human hesitation, and the hesitation, when it came, was almost always unofficial. The Cold War did not begin with a single event, but there is a moment that crystallizes what it actually was, beneath the rhetoric and the doctrine. In August of 1945, within days of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American military planners began drafting assessments of the Soviet Union as the next strategic problem. The war in the Pacific had not yet formally ended. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was still nominally intact, and American planners were already calculating how many atomic bombs it would take to destroy the Soviet state's industrial capacity. Not because war was inevitable, not because the Soviets had done anything to provoke it, but because the logic of the new weapon demanded it. If you possessed something that could end a nation, you had to plan for its use. Planning required targets. Targets required an enemy. The enemy was already identified before anyone had decided there was a conflict. This is the foundational reality that governments on both sides spent the entire Cold War obscuring. The weapons did not follow the politics. The politics, in many ways, followed the weapons. The existence of nuclear arsenals created institutional structures, military doctrines, intelligence bureaucracies, and strategic postures that developed their own momentum entirely separate from the stated ideological justifications. By the time most of these systems were fully operational, no single human being understood how all of them worked together. No one had a complete picture. Decision-making had been distributed across so many layers of classified protocol that the concept of a decision, in the traditional sense, had become largely theoretical. In 1950, a document was prepared within the American national security establishment that would shape the entire trajectory of the conflict. Its classification was so high that it was not officially acknowledged to exist for decades. National Security Council Report 68, which came to be known simply as NSC 68, was not a response to a specific Soviet action. It was a theoretical document. It argued that the United States needed to fundamentally transform its economy and its government into a permanent wartime posture, not because the Soviets were attacking, but because the logic of their ideology made eventual conflict inevitable. The document called for a 4-fold increase in defense spending. It framed every aspect of American foreign and domestic policy as a theater in a single global struggle. It was written before the Korean War began. When the Korean War began shortly afterward, it was used to justify the transformation it had already recommended. What NSC-68 actually accomplished, beyond its stated strategic goals, was to create a bureaucratic ecosystem that required the Soviet threat to be permanent, escalating, and existential in order to justify its own existence. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is an institutional reality. When an organization's budget, personnel, and prestige depend on the magnitude of a threat, that organization will consistently find the threat to be larger than it might otherwise appear. This dynamic operated simultaneously on both sides of the Iron Curtain, producing a feedback loop in which each side's escalations, themselves responses to perceived escalations by the other side, were interpreted by the other side as confirmation that their worst assessments had been correct. The first time the world came genuinely close to nuclear war, most of the world did not know it was happening. In November of 1950, during the Korean War, American radar systems detected what appeared to be a massive incoming Soviet air attack. Bomber formations were identified on radar screens. Air defense commands went to alert status. The response protocols were activated. It took several agonizing minutes before someone determined that what the radar had detected was a flight of geese. A large formation of birds, flying at the right altitude, at the right speed, in the right direction, had produced a signature on early radar systems that was functionally indistinguishable from a bomber formation. No nuclear weapons were involved in this incident. The alert was stood down, and the event was not disclosed publicly for many years, in part because acknowledging it would have raised uncomfortable questions about the reliability of the detection systems on which the entire deterrence architecture depended. This was not an isolated incident. It was the first in a long series of false alarms, equipment malfunctions, communication failures, and procedural misinterpretations that collectively represent the hidden infrastructure of the Cold War. They are hidden not because they were all individually catastrophic, but because their cumulative weight, taken together, demolishes the narrative that nuclear deterrence was a stable and reliable system. It was not stable. It was not reliable. It happened to not produce a catastrophe. Those are different things. The American and Soviet nuclear programs developed along parallel tracks that were, for long stretches, almost completely invisible to each other. The Soviet bomb program, which the American intelligence community consistently and badly underestimated, was built on a foundation of espionage, scientific brilliance, forced labor, and bureaucratic terror that the American public would not fully understand for decades. The scientists who built it worked under conditions in which a mistake, a delay, or a failed test could result in imprisonment or death. The program succeeded, not despite this pressure, but, in a grim institutional sense, because of it. There was no margin for the kind of internal debate and bureaucratic resistance that occasionally slowed American programs. The system produced results because it eliminated the option of not producing results. What this meant, in practical strategic terms, was that by the early 1950s, both superpowers possessed weapons of civilization-ending capability, and neither superpower had a realistic, complete or accurate picture of what the other side actually possessed, where it was deployed, or how quickly it could be used. The deterrence model, which required each side to know that the other could retaliate, was operating on the basis of estimates that were frequently wrong in both directions. There were periods during which American planners significantly overestimated Soviet capabilities, producing what became known as missile gaps that were later revealed to be largely fictional. There were also periods during which Soviet capabilities had been badly underestimated, meaning that the actual balance of terror was quite different from what either side believed it to be. The first serious attempt by either superpower to get accurate intelligence on the other's nuclear program was not diplomatic, it was photographic. In the early 1950s, the United States began developing a reconnaissance aircraft that could fly at altitudes beyond the effective ceiling of Soviet air defense systems. The program was run not by the military, but by the Central Intelligence Agency, specifically to keep it outside normal military oversight and reporting channels. The aircraft that emerged from this program, eventually designated the U-2, could fly at altitudes above 70,000 feet. It carried cameras capable of producing images with extraordinary resolution from heights at which Soviet fighters and missiles could not reach it. Beginning in 1956, it flew deep into Soviet territory, photographing military installations, missile sites, and industrial facilities that American intelligence had previously been able only to guess at. The Soviets knew immediately that they were being overflown. Their radar systems tracked the aircraft. Their fighter pilots attempted to intercept it and could not. Their surface-to-air missile systems initially lacked the range to reach it. For 4 years, the Soviet leadership was forced to watch its most sensitive military facilities being photographed by an aircraft it could not stop, and to say nothing publicly, because acknowledging the overflights would have meant acknowledging the inadequacy of Soviet air defenses. The American government, for its part, maintained elaborate cover stories about weather research and atmospheric studies. The program was one of the most significant intelligence operations of the entire Cold War and was completely unknown to the American public. In May of 1960, a U-2 aircraft flown by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union by a newly operational surface-to-air missile system. The Eisenhower administration initially denied that any overflight had occurred, then denied that it had been an intelligence mission. Then, when the Soviets produced both the wreckage of the aircraft and the pilot alive, was forced into a humiliating public reversal. The incident destroyed a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. It accelerated the deterioration of relations that would eventually lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it revealed, for those paying careful attention, something important about the mechanics of Cold War secrecy. It was not designed to withstand the light. It was designed to operate in the dark. When the dark was removed, even temporarily, the underlying reality was considerably more dangerous than the official narrative had suggested. The Berlin situation, which persisted in various forms throughout the entire Cold War, is a case study in how governments manage the permanent possibility of catastrophic escalation through administrative mechanisms. Berlin was, by any rational strategic assessment, indefensible. It was a Western enclave surrounded entirely by Soviet-controlled territory. The American, British, and French troops stationed there could not have held the city against a determined Soviet ground assault for more than a matter of days. Everyone knew this. The Soviets knew it. The Western commanders on the ground knew it. The diplomats and strategists in Washington and London and Paris knew it. The decision to defend Berlin anyway, or more precisely the decision to behave as though Berlin would be defended, was not a military decision. It was a psychological and political one. The defense of Berlin was not a military plan. It was a commitment, and the commitment itself was the deterrent. This logic, which became the operational basis for NATO's entire strategic posture, had a quality to it that was recognized at the time and never fully resolved. It only worked if it was believed, and it could only be believed if there was a genuine possibility that it would be acted upon, which meant that in order to prevent a catastrophe, the relevant parties had to genuinely be willing to risk one. The rational actors at the center of deterrence theory were not simply calculating probabilities, they were performing credibility, and the performance had to be convincing enough that no one would test it. In June of 1948, Stalin ordered the blockade of West Berlin, cutting off all land and water access to the western sectors of the city. The Truman administration faced a choice between 3 options, all of them bad. They could withdraw from Berlin, which would be a catastrophic symbolic defeat with implications for American commitments throughout Europe. They could attempt to break the blockade by force, which risked direct military confrontation with Soviet forces. Or they could attempt to supply the city entirely by air, which was logistically unprecedented and possibly impossible. They chose the airlift. For 11 months, Western aircraft flew round-the-clock missions into Berlin, eventually supplying more than 2 million people with food, coal, medicine, and machinery. At its peak, an aircraft was landing in West Berlin every 45 seconds. What has been less publicly discussed is the nuclear dimension of the Berlin crisis. During the airlift, the Truman administration ordered B-29 bombers, the same type of aircraft that had dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, to deploy to bases in Britain and Germany. The deployment was publicly announced. The implication was clear. What was not publicly disclosed at the time was that the aircraft deployed to Europe were not actually equipped to carry nuclear weapons. The bomb assembly teams, the specialized equipment, and the weapons themselves had not accompanied the aircraft. The nuclear deterrent that was supposed to be making Stalin hesitate was, in the most literal sense, a bluff. The Soviets may or may not have known this. The American public certainly did not. The pattern here, a public posture of nuclear readiness that did not always correspond to actual nuclear readiness, recurred throughout the Cold War in ways that were almost never disclosed. The deterrent worked. To the extent it worked, on the basis of perceived capabilities and perceived will. The actual capabilities and the actual will were classified, debated internally, and frequently quite different from what either side was projecting to the other. By the early 1950s, the American nuclear arsenal had grown to a size that required a systematic approach to targeting. You could not simply have thousands of nuclear weapons and no plan for how to use them. The planning that emerged from this requirement produced documents that, when they were eventually declassified, decades later, revealed a vision of nuclear war that bore almost no relationship to what had been presented to the American public. The single integrated operational plan, which became the master blueprint for American nuclear warfighting, called for the near-simultaneous delivery of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, China, and their allies across an enormous target list. Early versions of the plan called for strikes against hundreds of cities. The projected casualties in the classified assessments that accompanied the plan ran to hundreds of millions of people. And the plan made no provision for avoiding civilian casualties because the logic of the targeting required maximizing the destruction of industrial capacity, which was concentrated in cities. The planners who built this system were not monsters in any simple sense. They were people operating within a strategic logic that had its own internal coherence. If deterrence was to work, the threatened retaliation had to be credible. To be credible, it had to be massive. To be massive, it had to be pre-planned in detail, because there would not be time, in the event of an actual nuclear exchange, to make these decisions in the moment. The result was a plan for the murder of hundreds of millions of people that sat in classified filing cabinets, updated regularly, briefed to new administrations, and never subjected to any democratic deliberation whatsoever. When Robert McNamara, who served as Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson, was briefed on the existing war plan shortly after taking office in 1961, his reaction, which he described decades later, was one of genuine horror. The plan, as he understood it, would have killed something in the range of 600 million people, including many in neutral countries whose only offense was geographic proximity to the targets. He described it as simply a horrible thing. He then spent years trying to change it and succeeded only partially, because the institutional momentum behind the plan was by that point enormous. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which most people know as the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, has been substantially rewritten by declassified documents and by the testimony of participants that only became available after the Cold War ended. The public narrative, in which Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in a tense but ultimately rational negotiation that ended with the Soviets backing down, is accurate in its broad outlines and systematically misleading in its details. What the public narrative omits is the degree to which the crisis nearly escaped the control of both governments through mechanisms that had nothing to do with the decisions being made in Washington and Moscow. On October 27, 1962, the day that is remembered as the most dangerous day of the crisis, at least 3 separate incidents occurred that could independently have triggered a nuclear exchange, and that the leadership on both sides was unaware of until years or decades later. The first was the shooting down of an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The decision to fire was made by Soviet commanders on the ground in Cuba without authorization from Moscow. The standing orders for American forces were that if an aircraft were lost over Cuba, it would be presumed to have been shot down, and the surface-to-air missile battery responsible would be attacked. Kennedy, when informed of the shootdown, chose not to order the retaliatory strike. His advisors had assumed he would order it. He did not. The reasons he gave at the time were not the reasons that the declassified record suggests were operative. The decision was closer and more contingent than the public account has ever acknowledged. The second incident involved an American U-2 aircraft that became disoriented while flying a polar mission and accidentally penetrated Soviet airspace over the Chukchi Peninsula. Soviet fighters were scrambled to intercept it. American fighters armed with nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles were scrambled from Alaska to escort it out of Soviet airspace. The two groups of aircraft came close enough to each other that the situation could have produced an exchange. The American U-2 pilot found his way back to Alaska. The Soviet fighters returned to base. No shots were fired. This incident was classified for decades and was entirely unknown to the American public during the crisis itself. The third, and by any measure the most dangerous incident of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, did not involve aircraft at all. It took place underwater. A Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine, designated B-59, had been operating in the Atlantic near Cuba for several weeks. It had been subjected to depth charges by American naval forces who were attempting to force it to surface and identify itself, as was standard practice in such situations. The American forces did not know that the submarine was armed with a nuclear torpedo. They were using what they classified as practice depth charges, small explosive devices not intended to damage the submarine, only to signal it. The crew of the submarine, unable to communicate with Moscow due to radio silence protocols and subjected to what felt to them like a sustained depth charge attack, had reason to believe that war had already begun. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, made the decision to prepare the nuclear torpedo for launch. Under standard Soviet Navy protocol, a nuclear torpedo launch required the authorization of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. The captain and the political officer authorized the launch. The flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. There is no dramatic account of what was said in that submarine. The compartments were hot. The air was thick with carbon dioxide from the depleted scrubbers. The men had been underwater for weeks under conditions of extreme stress. Arkhipov refused. Savitsky eventually agreed to surface the submarine. The American forces, seeing it surface, took it for what it appeared to be and did not attack it. Arkhipov's decision was not reported publicly in the Soviet Union or in the United States for many years. The incident was classified on both sides. When it was eventually disclosed, it produced in many historians who had spent their careers studying the Cuban Missile Crisis a kind of retrospective vertigo. The most dangerous moment of the Cold War had not been the moments that were visible to either government. It had been a moment in a submarine that neither government knew about, resolved by the decision of one man who was not following protocol and whose name was not known to the general public until decades after his death. The operations that took place in the periphery of the Cold War, in the countries that became proxy battlegrounds for superpower competition, generated their own category of secrets that governments on both sides maintained with considerable diligence. The full scope of what the CIA did in Iran in 1953, in Guatemala in 1954, in the Congo in 1960, in Chile in 1973, in dozens of other countries across 4 decades, was not available to the American public during the events themselves, and has only become partly available through declassification processes that remain incomplete. The Iranian operation of 1953, in which the CIA and British intelligence organized a coup that overthrew the elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restored the Shah to absolute power, was officially denied by the United States government for 50 years. The declassified documents that eventually confirmed American involvement did not emerge until 2013. In the intervening 6 decades, the event shaped Iranian politics, Iranian attitudes toward the United States, and eventually the Islamic Revolution of 1979 in ways that are still operative today. The secret was maintained not because it was particularly difficult to keep, the broad outlines were known to many people involved, but because acknowledging it would have required a public reckoning with what American policy had actually consisted of, as opposed to what it had been described as. The nuclear close calls that are most frequently cited, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 1983 NATO exercise that came close to triggering a Soviet preemptive strike, are the ones that eventually became known because they involved enough participants that the information could not be entirely suppressed. There is a separate category of incidents about which governments have been more successful. These are the accidents involving nuclear weapons themselves. Between 1950 and 1980, the United States government officially acknowledged a number of what it termed broken arrow incidents, accidents involving nuclear weapons or nuclear weapon components. The acknowledged list includes incidents in which nuclear weapons were dropped from aircraft, lost at sea, damaged in crashes, and subjected to high explosives. In several of these incidents, the nuclear material was recovered. In others, it was not. There are nuclear weapons at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Savannah, Georgia. There are nuclear weapons components somewhere in the swamps of eastern North Carolina, where a B-52 broke apart in 1961 and dropped 2 thermonuclear bombs. One of them had 5 of its 6 safety mechanisms fail. The 6th held. What the official broken arrow list does not include by definition are the incidents that were never acknowledged. The classification system applied to nuclear weapon accidents was among the most restrictive in either government's arsenal. Personnel involved in these incidents were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that were enforced for decades. In some cases, the communities near which accidents occurred were never informed. The residents of Palomares, Spain, where a B-52 broke apart in 1966 and scattered radioactive material across the countryside, were not given complete information about the contamination for years. The cleanup, such as it was, removed the most contaminated soil and transported it to the United States. The residual contamination remained. American diplomatic pressure kept the full extent of it from being publicly disclosed for decades. The Soviet Union had its own category of nuclear accidents, which were maintained at an even higher level of secrecy. The explosion at the Kishtim nuclear facility in 1957, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history before Chernobyl, was classified and not acknowledged publicly by the Soviet government until 1989. The explosion contaminated hundreds of square kilometers of territory in the Ural Mountains. Tens of thousands of people were evacuated without being told why. The scale of the event was comparable to what would later happen at Chernobyl, but it occurred in a period when the Soviet government's capacity to control information about events inside its own territory was essentially complete. The secrecy around Kishtim was maintained not because the information would have been operationally useful to an adversary, but because acknowledging it would have undermined the Soviet government's narrative of nuclear mastery and technological superiority. This is a pattern that recurs throughout Cold War history on both sides. Secrecy was frequently maintained not for the strategic reasons claimed, but for the political reason that the truth was incompatible with the public image the government was trying to project. The American reconnaissance satellite program, which grew directly out of the U-2 experience after the Powers shootdown, produced intelligence that fundamentally shaped American strategic assessments throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The satellites, which operated under a program codenamed Corona, photographed Soviet territory continuously from orbits that the Soviets could track but could not interfere with. The intelligence they produced was startling in its implications. For much of the late 1950s and early 1960s, American strategic planning had been based on the assumption of a significant Soviet advantage in intercontinental ballistic missiles, the so-called missile gap that had been a major issue in the 1960 presidential campaign. The satellite imagery proved that no such gap existed. The Soviets had, at the time of the campaign, a handful of operational ICBMs. The United States had a substantial numerical advantage. This information was classified at the highest level. It was shared with only a small number of officials, It could not be used publicly to correct the political narrative about the missile gap, because using it publicly would have revealed that the United States had the capability to photograph Soviet missile installations from orbit, which itself was classified. The result was that American defense policy continued to be justified in public on the basis of a threat assessment that the government knew privately to be wrong, because correcting the public assessment would have required disclosing capabilities that it wanted to protect. This is the ordinary texture of Cold War governance: classified truths producing public fictions that then drove policy in ways that the people making the decisions knew were not fully grounded in reality. The nuclear command and control systems that both superpowers developed are among the least understood and most consequential technological legacies of the Cold War. The fundamental problem they were designed to solve was this: a nuclear deterrent requires that an adversary believe you can and will retaliate even if you are struck first. But the conditions that would obtain after a first strike, destroyed communications, dead or incapacitated leadership, disrupted military infrastructure, are precisely the conditions under which retaliation becomes most difficult to coordinate. The solution both sides arrived at, through different means and at different times, was to develop systems that could authorize and coordinate nuclear retaliation with reduced or zero human intervention. The American system for ensuring retaliation capability involved, among other measures, the concept of an airborne command post, an aircraft that would remain continuously aloft and that could command nuclear forces even if all ground-based command infrastructure had been destroyed. The system also involved pre-delegated authority, arrangements under which military commanders at various levels had the authority to order nuclear launches under specified conditions without needing to receive explicit authorization from higher levels of command. The full scope of these pre-delegation arrangements was never disclosed. The conditions under which field commanders could have ordered nuclear launches without presidential authorization were classified, and in many cases the relevant documents remain classified. The Soviet equivalent system, developed somewhat later and under different institutional conditions, went considerably further. The system that became known in the West as Dead Hand and that the Soviets called Perimeter was a semi-automated command and communications system designed to ensure nuclear retaliation even if the entire Soviet leadership had been destroyed. The system worked, in broad outline, by monitoring for indicators of nuclear attack, including seismic sensors, radiation monitors, and communication system disruptions. If these indicators suggested that a nuclear attack had occurred, and if the normal command communications had gone silent, the system could generate and transmit launch authorization codes to Soviet nuclear forces without requiring human authorization. The existence of this system was not confirmed publicly until after the Cold War ended. American strategic planners had suspected that some such system existed, but had no confirmed knowledge of its parameters. The Soviets had not disclosed it. The logic of its existence was entirely rational within the framework of deterrence theory. If the adversary believed that killing your leadership would disable your retaliatory capability, they had an incentive to strike your leadership first. A system that removed leadership from the retaliation equation removed that incentive. But the system's existence also meant that the United States and the Soviet Union had, by the 1980s, collectively created a scenario in which the end of human civilization could be initiated by a computer program responding to sensor data. The 1983 nuclear war scare, which has become somewhat better known in recent years but remains underappreciated in its severity, represents the period during which the semi-automated nature of nuclear decision-making came closest to producing catastrophe through the interaction of political tension, military exercise, and sensor malfunction. The Reagan administration's approach to the Soviet Union in the early 1980s was notably more aggressive in its rhetoric and its operational posture than any American administration since the early Kennedy period. American military exercises had become larger, more realistic, and more explicitly oriented towards scenarios that involved first use of nuclear weapons. American aircraft were flying towards Soviet airspace, and then turning away at the last moment, testing Soviet air defense response times and radar coverage. The psychological effect of this pattern on Soviet military and political leadership, already under considerable stress from the leadership transitions that had followed the deaths of Brezhnev and Andropov, was substantial. In September of 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite system designed to detect the infrared signatures of American ICBM launches reported the launch of 5 missiles from the United States. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, was responsible for evaluating the alert and passing it up the chain of command. The standing protocol was clear. A confirmed launch detection was to be reported immediately. Petrov looked at the alert, considered the information available to him, noted that 5 missiles was an implausibly small number for an American first strike, noted that the ground-based radar systems had not confirmed the launches, and decided without any authority to decide this, that the alert was a false alarm. He reported it as a malfunction. He was correct. The satellite system had been fooled by an unusual alignment of sunlight reflecting off cloud tops over the American Midwest, a sensor condition that had not been anticipated by the system's designers. If Petrov had reported the alert as a genuine launch detection, it would have been passed to the Soviet leadership at a moment of extremely high tension. What they would have done with that information is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. Petrov was not praised for his decision. He was quietly reprimanded for failing to properly fill out the incident logs in the confusion of the moment. He was transferred to a less sensitive posting. The incident was classified. He did not speak about it publicly until after the Cold War ended. 2 months later, in November of 1983, NATO conducted an exercise called Able Archer 83 that was designed to practice the procedures for the transition from conventional to nuclear warfare. The exercise was realistic to a degree that previous NATO exercises had not been. It used new communication procedures, new formats, and simulated conditions of nuclear release authorization. Soviet intelligence, monitoring the exercise closely and already primed by years of intelligence assessments, suggesting that the Reagan administration might be preparing for a preemptive strike, interpreted elements of the exercise as potentially being cover for an actual attack. Soviet nuclear forces in Europe were placed at an elevated state of readiness. Aircraft at some bases were loaded with nuclear weapons. The Soviet leadership, according to documents that emerged after the Soviet Union collapsed, was genuinely uncertain whether they were watching a practice run or the real thing. The American government did not know, during the exercise, that the Soviets had reached this level of alarm. A British intelligence officer with access to Soviet communications recognized what was happening and alerted his superiors. The information eventually reached the Reagan administration. Reagan's response, according to his personal diary and to accounts given by people who briefed him on the intelligence, was one of genuine surprise. He had not understood that the Soviets might interpret American military exercises as preparation for attack. He had been operating within a strategic framework that assumed mutual rationality without fully accounting for the information environment in which each side was making its assessments. The intelligence that triggered Reagan's reassessment came from a source whose identity was classified for decades. Oleg Gordievsky, a senior KGB officer who had been working as a British intelligence asset since the early 1970s, had passed the information about the Soviet alert during Able Archer through his handlers. His identity, if it had become known, would have meant his death. The information that arguably contributed to the de-escalation of American rhetoric in the final years of the Cold War arrived through a channel that officially did not exist, provided by a man whose contribution could not be acknowledged, about an event that was itself classified. The proxy wars of the Cold War produced their own categories of institutional secrecy that operated somewhat differently from the nuclear secrets. The nuclear secrets were maintained primarily because disclosure would have undermined deterrence or revealed capability. The proxy war secrets were maintained primarily because disclosure would have required a reckoning with the actual content of American and Soviet policy, as opposed to its stated justification. In Vietnam, the gap between what the American government was telling the public and what it knew internally to be true was documented in extraordinary detail in the study that came to be known as the Pentagon Papers. The study, commissioned by McNamara himself before he left the Defense Department, traced the history of American involvement in Vietnam from the Truman administration through the Johnson administration, and demonstrated systematically that decision-makers at every level had known privately that the war was unwinnable while stating publicly that it was being won. The study was classified. When Daniel Ellsberg, who had worked on the study, provided copies to the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Nixon administration attempted to suppress publication on national security grounds. The Supreme Court ruled against suppression. What the Pentagon Papers established in documentary detail was something that went beyond the Vietnam War itself. They established that the classification system had been used systematically and deliberately, not to protect genuinely sensitive military information, but to protect the government from accountability for decisions that had been made on the basis of assessments that its own officials knew to be wrong. The classification system was not merely a mechanism for protecting secrets. It was a mechanism for managing the relationship between the government and the governed. This is the context in which the other Cold War secrets need to be understood. They are not simply anomalies, instances of compartmentalization required by legitimate operational security concerns. They are part of a pattern in which the institutional architecture of secrecy came to serve political functions that were entirely separate from and frequently in conflict with the stated national security rationale. The government was not keeping secrets from the Soviets. It was keeping secrets from its own citizens. The radiation experiments conducted on American citizens without their knowledge or consent, which were eventually acknowledged and partially documented through the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments that reported in 1995, represent one of the clearest examples of this pattern. Between the 1940s and the 1970s, the American government and its contractors conducted experiments involving deliberate exposure of human subjects to radiation in dosages and under conditions that the subjects had not consented to. The subjects included hospital patients, prisoners, soldiers, and in some cases individuals who had no awareness that they were being exposed to anything at all. The experiments were justified internally as necessary for understanding the medical effects of nuclear weapons and for developing treatments for radiation exposure. Many of the experiments were conducted under classification that prevented the subjects or their families from ever knowing what had happened. Soldiers who developed medical conditions consistent with radiation exposure decades later were denied information about their participation in tests that might have been relevant to their diagnoses. The classification persisted long after any plausible operational security justification for it had expired. It persisted because disclosure would have produced liability, political consequences, and a public conversation about the relationship between national security research and human rights that the government preferred not to have. The biological weapons programs that both the United States and the Soviet Union developed during the Cold War are another category in which the gap between official statements and actual programs was maintained with considerable institutional discipline. The United States officially renounced biological weapons in 1969 and signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972. The Nixon administration's renunciation was genuine, in the sense that the existing offensive biological weapons stockpiles were destroyed. It was not comprehensive in the sense that certain research programs continued under different classifications and justifications, and in the sense that the intelligence community maintained significant uncertainty about the scope and status of the Soviet program. The Soviet biological weapons program, which continued in active development decades after the Soviet Union signed the Biological Weapons Convention, was one of the most significant and least publicly known strategic programs of the Cold War. The program, which operated under an organization called Biopreparat, employed tens of thousands of scientists and technicians at dozens of facilities across the Soviet Union. It developed weaponized versions of plague, anthrax, smallpox, and a range of other pathogens. It produced these agents in quantities that would have been adequate to cause catastrophic casualties in any targeted population. The existence of the program was known to American intelligence in broad outline by the late 1970s and in considerably more detail by the late 1980s, but the full scope was not confirmed until after the Soviet Union collapsed, when biopreparat defectors provided detailed accounts. The most significant of these defectors was Ken Alibek, who had served as deputy director of biopreparat. His account, which was not published in a form accessible to the general public until 1999, described a program that had continued developing new biological agents right through the Gorbachev era, in direct violation of the treaty the Soviet Union had signed. It described accidents, including a 1979 anthrax outbreak in Sverdlovsk, that the Soviet government attributed to contaminated meat, and that was actually the result of an accidental release from a biological weapons production facility. The Soviet government maintained the contaminated meat story for a decade. American intelligence had assessed that the outbreak was weapons-related, but had not pressed the case publicly, in part because doing so would have required disclosing the intelligence sources and methods on which the assessment was based. The Sverdlovsk anthrax outbreak killed at least 64 people by the official count, and almost certainly more. It remained a state secret in the Soviet Union for over a decade. When it was eventually acknowledged, the acknowledgement was partial and came in a political context in which the Soviet Union was dissolving and the biopreparat program was an embarrassment to the successor government rather than a state asset to be protected. The intelligence operations that both superpowers conducted against their own citizens, as distinct from the foreign intelligence operations that are more publicly acknowledged, represent another layer of Cold War secrecy with consequences that extended well beyond the conflict itself. In the United States, the programs that became known collectively under the names of various congressional investigations, including COINTELPRO, MKUltra, and Operation Chaos, involved systematic surveillance, disruption, and in some cases the active manipulation of domestic political movements, journalists, academics, and ordinary citizens who had attracted the attention of the national security apparatus. MKUltra, the CIA's research program into mind control and psychological manipulation, involved experiments with drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and various other techniques on subjects who were frequently unaware that they were being experimented on. The program ran from the early 1950s through the mid-1960s. The CIA destroyed most of its records in 1973 in anticipation of congressional scrutiny. The records that survived and were disclosed through the congressional investigations of the mid-1970s and through subsequent Freedom of Information Act requests were partial, incomplete, and selected. The full scope of the program is not known and may not be knowable given the deliberate destruction of documentation. The relationship between the CIA and organized crime during the Cold War, which included collaboration on assassination attempts against foreign leaders, and in several cases the active protection of criminal enterprises that served intelligence purposes, is another area where the documentary record is systematically incomplete. The known cases, including the various attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro that were eventually disclosed through the Church Committee investigations, represent a fraction of the operations that were planned, attempted, or carried out. The selection effect in what is known about these programs is significant. What is known is what survived document destruction or was disclosed by participants. What was successfully concealed is, by definition, not known. The nuclear close call that occurred in 1995, after the Cold War had officially ended, is in some ways the most instructive episode in the entire history of nuclear near misses, precisely because it happened in the context of an ostensibly changed relationship between Russia and the United States. In January of 1995, Norwegian scientists launched a Black Brant Tweed research rocket from an island off the Norwegian coast to study the aurora borealis. They had notified Russian authorities of the launch in advance through appropriate diplomatic channels. The notification did not reach the relevant Russian military commanders. The radar signature of the rocket, as it ascended, was consistent with a Trident submarine-launched ballistic missile. The Russian early warning system processed the signature and assessed it as a possible nuclear attack. The nuclear briefcase, the portable command and control system that gives the Russian president the capability to authorize nuclear launches, was activated and brought to Boris Yeltsin. This was the first time in history that the Russian presidential nuclear command system had been activated in response to a potential incoming attack. Yeltsin, along with his military commanders, had several minutes to decide whether to authorize a retaliatory launch. They waited. As the rocket's trajectory became clear, it was identified as not heading toward Russia. The alert was stood down. Yeltsin's decision to wait, rather than to launch immediately on the basis of the initial alert, was almost certainly the correct one given the information that became available. But it was also a decision that was made in conditions of extreme time pressure, based on incomplete and ambiguous information by a president whose health and judgment had been matters of public speculation. The institutional safeguards that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of false alarm had failed. The political channels that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of misunderstanding had failed. The outcome was determined by the decision of one man to wait rather than act. The Yanayev coup attempt of August 1991, which took place in the final months of the Soviet Union, created a nuclear command and control situation whose full implications have never been entirely resolved. For several days, the legitimate president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was held under house arrest at his dacha in Crimea, while a group of hardliners attempted to reverse the political reforms he had initiated. The nuclear briefcase that was supposed to remain with the president was, for the duration of the coup attempt, not with Gorbachev. It was with the coup plotters. Or more precisely, it was with military officers whose loyalties and chain of command were uncertain. The precise location of Soviet nuclear command authority during the coup attempt is a question that has not been definitively answered by any declassified document. The dissolution of the Soviet Union created a nuclear situation that was entirely outside any of the frameworks that had governed Cold War nuclear doctrine. Suddenly, there were 4 countries with nuclear weapons on the former Soviet territory: Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. The arrangements under which these weapons were controlled, the personnel who operated them, the command systems through which they could be authorized, and the political authorities to whom those systems reported were all in various states of transition and uncertainty. Ukraine, which inherited the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world by virtue of being where the weapons had been deployed, did not have operational control of them, but the situation was novel enough that the confidence with which that assessment could be made was not absolute. The negotiations that eventually produced the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, under which Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons on its territory in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, were conducted against this background of genuine uncertainty. The secrecy around the technical details of Soviet nuclear command and control during the transition period was maintained by all relevant parties, in part because none of them had a complete picture, and in part because a complete and accurate public account of how close the transition came to producing genuinely uncontrolled nuclear material would have been deeply alarming. The chemical weapons programs that both superpowers developed and that have left physical and environmental legacies that continue to affect populations today represent another category of Cold War secrets with ongoing consequences. The American chemical weapons stockpile that existed at the end of the Cold War included agents that had been manufactured decades earlier, stored in facilities that were aging, and in some cases leaking. The communities near chemical weapon storage facilities were frequently not informed of the contents of the facilities or of the risks associated with their proximity to them. The cleanup and destruction of chemical weapons stockpiles, which proceeded through the 1990s and 2000s, produced its own secondary body of classified information about the condition of stockpiles, the environmental contamination they had produced, and the medical effects on communities and workers who had been exposed to them. The Soviet chemical weapons program, whose scope was significantly underestimated by Western intelligence for most of the Cold War, included the development of a class of nerve agents that went under the general name of Novichok. These agents were developed in the final decades of the Cold War under a program codenamed Foliant. They were specifically designed to be undetectable by the detection systems NATO forces were using and to be resistant to the medical countermeasures NATO forces possessed. The existence of the Novichok program was not confirmed publicly until the early 1990s, when a Russian chemist who had worked on the program, Vil Mirzayanov, disclosed it to the Russian press and was subsequently arrested. The program's existence was denied by the Russian government for years after his disclosure. The agents themselves remained relevant long after the Cold War ended, as the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in 2018 demonstrated. The environmental consequences of Cold War military programs, which are among the most enduring physical legacies of the conflict, were systematically concealed from the populations affected by them. The Hanford site in Washington state, which produced plutonium for American nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War, is the most contaminated nuclear site in the United States. The full scope of contamination at Hanford was not publicly disclosed until environmental surveys in the 1980s and 1990s began to reveal the extent to which radioactive and chemical wastes had been improperly stored, leaked into the soil, and entered the Columbia River watershed. The workers who had operated the facilities and the communities downwind and downstream had not been given adequate information about the risks they were exposed to. The Soviet Union's equivalent sites were in comparable or worse condition and were maintained under substantially more complete secrecy. The nuclear testing program conducted at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, which involved above-ground nuclear tests in a region with a significant civilian population, exposed hundreds of thousands of people to radiation over a period of decades. The effects on the local population, which include elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, and immune system disorders that continue to affect subsequent generations, were studied by Soviet scientists who were required to classify their findings. The population was not informed. The testing continued until 1989. The intelligence estimates that drove the most consequential decisions of the Cold War were, with some notable exceptions, systematically wrong in ways that were not disclosed at the time and that have only partially been acknowledged since. The bomber gap of the 1950s, which postulated a significant Soviet advantage in long-range bombers, was a fiction largely generated by a Soviet disinformation operation that exploited an American aerial parade. During Aviation Day celebrations in 1955, the Soviets flew the same squadron of Bison bombers repeatedly over the reviewing stand, creating the impression, for American observers, of a much larger force than actually existed. American intelligence assessments, based on observation of the parade, contributed to defense procurement decisions that cost billions of dollars. The missile gap of the late 1950s and early 1960s was, as previously noted, the inverse of reality. The intelligence community's assessments of Soviet ICBM capabilities were based on a combination of overestimated production capacity, questionable signals intelligence, and institutional incentives that rewarded more alarming estimates over more accurate ones. When the Corona satellite program provided definitive evidence of the actual Soviet ICBM force, the corrected assessment was classified, and the public debate continued on the basis of estimates that the government knew to be wrong. The Team B exercise of 1976, in which the CIA allowed a group of outside analysts with known hawkish political views to challenge the agency's own assessments of Soviet strategic capabilities and intentions, produced a report that argued the CIA had systematically underestimated Soviet military capabilities and that Soviet doctrine envisioned fighting and winning a nuclear war. The Team B report was leaked to the press and became a significant factor in the political environment that produced the Reagan defense buildup. When the Soviet archives became accessible after the Cold War ended, the evidence they contained was substantially inconsistent with the Team B assessment. Soviet military doctrine, as reflected in actual Soviet military planning documents, was considerably more defensively oriented and considerably less confident about nuclear war fighting than Team B had argued. The way these intelligence failures were managed institutionally is itself instructive. When an intelligence assessment proved to be wrong in a way that had driven expenditures of hundreds of billions of dollars and shaped American foreign policy for years or decades, the typical institutional response was not public acknowledgement and accountability. It was reclassification of the relevant documents, quiet revision of subsequent estimates, and the continuation of institutional careers that had been built on the erroneous assessments. The feedback loop between intelligence estimates and policy decisions operated in the dark, adjusted in the dark, and was corrected in the dark. The public saw the policy. It did not see the assessments that drove the policy or the revisions to those assessments that followed when the assessments proved wrong. The space race, which was presented to the American public as a competition for scientific achievement and national prestige, was operationally inseparable from the competition to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles. The rockets that launched Sputnik and Vostok and the Mercury and Apollo capsules were, structurally and technologically, the same rockets that were being developed to carry nuclear warheads. The engineering achievements celebrated as triumphs of civilian science were achieved by organizations whose primary mandate was military. The scientists and engineers who put men on the moon were, in many cases, working within programs whose ultimate purpose was to improve the accuracy, reliability, and payload capacity of nuclear delivery systems. This connection was not hidden exactly, but it was consistently underemphasized in public presentations of the space program, which framed the competition in terms of national character and scientific ambition rather than in terms of the underlying strategic reality. The communications infrastructure of nuclear command and control, the systems through which launch orders would have been transmitted in the event of a nuclear exchange, were among the most closely held technical secrets of both superpowers throughout the Cold War. The vulnerability of these systems was a persistent strategic problem. If communications between the National Command Authority and the forces that would execute a nuclear launch could be disrupted, either by a preemptive attack or by the electromagnetic effects of nuclear detonations, the entire deterrence architecture was potentially compromised. The solutions developed by both sides to this problem, including the Soviet dead hand system already discussed, involved a degree of automation and pre-delegation that made the systems progressively less dependent on human decision-making and more dependent on sensors, algorithms, and pre-programmed responses. The American system known as SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, was regularly revised, but its fundamental architecture, which called for a massive, coordinated, essentially simultaneous nuclear strike against a comprehensive target list, persisted throughout the Cold War with modifications that were significant at the margins, but that did not alter the basic character of the plan. The plan was designed to be executed under time pressure, in conditions of degraded communications by commanders who might have limited information about the current strategic situation. It was, in other words, designed to function in conditions where careful deliberation was impossible, which meant that in those conditions it would function with or without the careful deliberation that might otherwise have modified or halted it. The defectors and intelligence assets whose information shaped Cold War decision-making on both sides operated under conditions of secrecy that frequently extended to denying their existence for decades. The British intelligence penetrations of the Soviet system and the Soviet penetrations of Western intelligence created a situation in which the intelligence assessments being produced by both sides were, in some cases, based on information that had been deliberately distorted by the other side. The Soviet penetration of British intelligence through Kim Philby and his associates meant that some of the intelligence products being used by Western decision-makers during the most critical periods of the Cold War had been contaminated by Soviet disinformation for years before the penetrations were discovered. The full scope of the penetrations on both sides has not been fully disclosed. Some of the most sensitive counterintelligence investigations of the Cold War period remain classified. The question of whether particular intelligence assessments were based on genuine intelligence or on intelligence that had been shaped by adversarial penetration is, for many of the most consequential decisions of the Cold War, unanswerable. The arms control negotiations that produced the treaties of the Cold War period were conducted with the understanding that verification was limited, that both sides had incentives to cheat at the margins, and that the political value of the treaties was in some cases independent of their actual arms control effects. The SALT agreements of the 1970s produced verification regimes that were sophisticated by the standards of the time, and that, the intelligence community assessed, could detect significant violations. The monitoring was done through the same national technical means, primarily satellite reconnaissance, that had been developed for other intelligence purposes. The data produced by this monitoring was classified. When American intelligence assessed that the Soviet Union might be cheating on particular provisions of particular treaties, these assessments were handled within the classified arms control compliance review process. The results of this process were sometimes reported to Congress in classified testimony and sometimes not reported at all. The public debate about arms control compliance was conducted against a background of classified assessments that were not available to the public participants in the debate. This structure made it essentially impossible for outside analysts or public opinion to meaningfully evaluate the government's claims about treaty compliance or non-compliance, since the underlying evidence was classified. The naval dimension of the Cold War, which involved sustained and intensive operations by submarines of both superpowers in close proximity to each other throughout the entire conflict, produced incidents that were maintained at the highest levels of classification for decades. American and Soviet submarines tracked each other, collided with each other, surveilled each other's operations, and occasionally came close enough to mutual destruction that the commanding officers involved faced decisions whose implications extended well beyond the fate of their individual vessels. The practice of trailing Soviet submarines with American submarines, which was a primary intelligence collection mission throughout the Cold War, involved operations in which American submarines deliberately operated at extremely close range to their Soviet counterparts. The tactical situations that developed during these operations were sometimes dangerous. There were collisions. There were near collisions. There were situations in which the commanding officer of an American submarine made decisions about whether to continue tracking, break off, or take actions that would have had strategic implications without the ability to consult with any higher authority in circumstances where his own submarine was in potential danger. These operations were classified at the highest level. The families of submariners knew their loved ones were doing dangerous work. They were not told the nature of the danger or the specifics of the operations. The submariners themselves were bound by security oaths that prevented them from discussing their operations. The incidents that occurred during these operations, including the collisions between American and Soviet submarines that occurred on multiple occasions during the Cold War, were classified when they occurred and in many cases remained classified for decades afterward. The nuclear weapons that were routinely carried by surface ships and submarines of both navies and the operational protocols governing their use represented another layer of the nuclear command and control problem that was managed somewhat differently at sea than on land. The authority of naval commanders to use nuclear weapons, particularly on submarines that were by definition not in regular communication with higher command authority, was a persistent and difficult problem. The solutions developed involved pre-delegation arrangements that were never fully disclosed, and that, in the context of a crisis, might have operated somewhat differently from what any national command authority would have chosen. The crash of a Soviet Golf II-class submarine in the Pacific in 1968, an event known to American intelligence as the K-129 incident, produced one of the most extraordinary classified operations of the Cold War. The American intelligence community, using acoustic detection data from the Navy's sound surveillance system, located the wreckage of the submarine at a depth of nearly 3 miles in the Pacific Ocean. The decision was made to attempt to secretly recover the submarine, or at least significant portions of it, to obtain the nuclear weapons and communications equipment on board. The operation that followed, Project Azorian, involved the construction of an enormous purpose-built ship, nominally a deep-sea mining vessel, that concealed a recovery mechanism capable of lifting portions of the submarine from the ocean floor. The ship, the Glomar Explorer, was built by the CIA with funding from the Department of Defense and with the participation of Howard Hughes's organization as a cover, since Hughes was publicly involved in ocean mining enterprises that provided a plausible explanation for the vessel's construction and capabilities. The Glomar Explorer was built, deployed, and used to recover a portion of the K-129. The recovery was partial. A significant portion of the submarine was lost when a claw mechanism failed during the lift. What was recovered included the bodies of Soviet sailors, portions of the submarine structure, and, according to some accounts, materials of significant intelligence value. The operation was classified. The cover story was maintained. The Soviet government did not know that the United States had located and partially recovered their submarine. The American government did not tell them. The bodies of the Soviet sailors recovered from the K-129 were buried at sea in a ceremony that was filmed but that could not be disclosed because disclosing it would have disclosed the recovery operation. The film of the burial ceremony was eventually made public in the 1990s. The full scope of what was recovered and what intelligence was derived from it has not been publicly disclosed. The final decade of the Cold War, from roughly 1980 to 1991, combined the highest levels of nuclear tension since the Cuban Missile Crisis, with a degree of technological complexity in the nuclear systems of both sides that made the probability of accidental or inadvertent escalation greater than it had been in any previous period. Both sides had moved toward launch-on-warning postures, meaning that they intended to launch their nuclear forces upon confirmed detection of an incoming attack before that attack could destroy their own weapons. Launch-on-warning requires that the detection systems be reliable and that the decision cycle be fast. Both conditions introduced specific and serious risks. The Soviet decision to develop the perimeter system, the automated command and control system that could order a nuclear launch without human intervention, was itself a response to the American strategic posture. American planners had developed a doctrine called decapitation, which targeted the Soviet leadership and command infrastructure in a way that might eliminate the ability to command Soviet nuclear forces before they could be launched. Perimeter was the Soviet counter, a system designed specifically to ensure that decapitation could not prevent retaliation. The two systems, American first strike planning and Soviet automated response, together created a strategic dynamic in which nuclear war could have been initiated and conducted with minimal or zero human decision-making at the most critical moments. The Reagan administration's Strategic Defense Initiative, announced in 1983 and known publicly as Star Wars, was perceived by the Soviet leadership as potentially destabilizing for reasons that were never fully communicated in public. The American public presentation of SDI framed it as a defensive system, a shield that would protect Americans from nuclear attack. The Soviet military and political leadership understood it differently. If the United States developed a functional missile defense system, the analysis ran, it would potentially undermine the Soviet deterrent by allowing the United States to absorb a Soviet retaliatory strike. This would give the United States a first strike option that it did not currently have. Even if SDI never worked as advertised, the Soviet military could not afford to assume it would not. The program therefore drove Soviet military spending in ways that contributed to the broader economic crisis that preceded the Soviet collapse. The extent to which American strategic planners understood this dynamic and factored it into their assessments of SDI's strategic value is a question whose answer lies partly in classified documents that have not been fully disclosed. There were American analysts who argued internally that SDI was strategically destabilizing for precisely the reasons the Soviets identified. Their analyses were part of the classified debate, but did not reach the public discourse in a way that would have allowed informed democratic deliberation about the program. The Gorbachev era and the reform process that ultimately led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union was shaped in significant part by information that was itself classified or that was being deliberately managed by various actors on both sides. The extent to which American intelligence had correctly assessed the internal weaknesses of the Soviet system, the degree of economic stagnation, the failure of the administrative economy, the depth of popular disenchantment with the system, was a matter of significant internal debate within the American intelligence community throughout the 1980s. The CIA's assessments of Soviet economic performance, which had consistently painted a somewhat more favorable picture of the Soviet economy than the eventual reality warranted, were themselves a matter of controversy within the intelligence community and have been the subject of retrospective criticism that acknowledges the assessments were systematically wrong in important ways. The intelligence community's failure to predict the Soviet collapse, which occurred over a period of years in plain sight of American intelligence assets, is a case study in institutional limitations that was addressed in various classified retrospectives and that produced some public acknowledgement of the failure. The acknowledgement was limited. The classified retrospectives are still largely classified. The institutional changes that followed the failure are difficult to assess from outside the classification structure. The public discourse about why the intelligence community missed the Soviet collapse operates largely without access to the evidence that would allow a complete account. The nuclear material security problems that emerged after the Soviet collapse were, for several years, managed in conditions of acute uncertainty that were reflected in classified assessments of a kind that have been only partially disclosed. The American government knew from various intelligence sources that the security of some portion of the former Soviet nuclear arsenal and nuclear material stockpiles was inadequate. The Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which provided American funding for securing and destroying former Soviet weapons, was itself a public acknowledgement that the problem existed. The full scope of the problem, as assessed by American intelligence, was not publicly disclosed. There were specific incidents during the early 1990s involving the diversion of nuclear material from former Soviet facilities that were known to American intelligence and that were not publicly disclosed at the time. The management of these incidents involved diplomatic and intelligence interventions that were conducted quietly, without public acknowledgement, because public acknowledgement would have raised questions about the adequacy of the response and about what else might have been diverted without detection. The public's understanding of the nuclear security problem in the former Soviet Union was based on general threat assessments rather than on specific incident reporting, and the gap between what was generally assessed and what was specifically known was itself classified. The systems, institutions, protocols, and doctrines that sustained the Cold War for 4 decades did not dissolve when the Soviet Union dissolved. The American nuclear arsenal remained deployed. The targeting plans were revised, but the fundamental architecture persisted. The military alliances created to prosecute the Cold War expanded rather than contracted. The intelligence bureaucracies that had been built to monitor Soviet capabilities shifted their focus but maintained their size, their authorities, and their classification structures. The concept of nuclear deterrence, which requires the permanent maintenance of forces capable of ending civilization, did not change its character because the specific adversary relationship that had generated it had nominally concluded. The Russian nuclear arsenal, inherited from the Soviet state, remained operational. The command and control systems that governed it, including the perimeter system, were maintained. Russian nuclear doctrine evolved over the following decades, in ways that were assessed by American intelligence, but that were not fully disclosed publicly. The physical infrastructure of Cold War nuclear competition, the missiles, the submarines, the bombers, the command centers, the early warning systems, continued to exist and to function, pointed at the same general targets they had been pointed at for decades, operated by successor institutions with different names but similar cultures and similar operational frameworks. The documents that would allow a complete account of what the Cold War actually was, as opposed to what it was described as, remained largely classified. The National Archives of Russia, which opened briefly and partially in the early 1990s, have been progressively reclosed. The American classification system continues to protect documents from the Cold War period, whose operational sensitivity, in any direct military sense, has long since expired. The institutional reasons for this continued classification are the same institutional reasons that drove classification throughout the conflict. The truth, completely told, is incompatible with the institutional self-interest of the organizations that generated and managed the secrets. It always was.